did I hear you correct there? Did you say the legitimacy of the Communist Party is now to some extent based on new Confucianism, on Confucian sentiments in the population?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a view that, of course, it's still officially a Marxist political system, but Marxism is not a sufficient source of let's call it values-based legitimacy anymore. I mean, it's still an important source, but there's a view that the communist, political system is actually the latest iteration of a much older political system, which was strongly influenced by the Confucian tradition.
Daniel Bell moved to China roughly 20 years ago from Singapore. He earned his PhD in Oxford, and he is a political philosopher, public intellectual, published widely. His books include the Dean of Shandong, Just Hierarchy with his wife Wang Pei, The New China Model, published 2015, and China's New Confucianism, 2008. He's quite a fixture, quite well known in the expat circles, in the China Watcher circles, but also in mainland Chinese academia, where he is a proponent of New Confucianism, both in mainland Chinese academia and towards English-speaking audiences in the West. And he is in part also well known among Chinese academics because he was the first non-Chinese dean of a mainland Chinese political science faculty, namely the political science faculty at Shandong University in Qingdao, where he started in 2017. Before that, Daniel was at Tsinghua in Beijing, so he moved from Beijing to Qingdao, from Qingdao to Hong Kong. And now in Hong Kong, he is the chair of political theory at Hong Kong University of Hong Kong's Faculty of Law. And his latest book, where he reflected on his time in Qingdao as the dean of the political science faculty, is titled The Dean of Shandong, published 2023. And all his latest books are published by Princeton University Press. Welcome, Daniel. Exciting topic. Let me ask a very simple question to start us off. What is New Confucianism, and what is new about
it? Thank you, Eric, for the kind introduction. And that's not a simple question at all. Well, the simple answer is that it was a title which was actually selected by my editor for a book called China's New Confucianism. But the basic idea is that for most of the 20th century, and this predates 1949, the establishment of communist China, the dominant tradition was this tradition of anti-traditionalism in China, meaning that most intellectuals, political reformers, and revolutionaries blamed China's traditions for its so-called backwardness relative, especially to Western powers. And so Confucianism was the main part of the tradition. So there was this view that Confucianism is feudal, patriarchal, backwards, and it's the cause of China's problems. And we need to attack Confucianism to move on to a new and modern world. And of course, there were some exceptions, but generally speaking, that was a dominant tradition throughout the 20th century. And frankly, it was a big surprise. I mean, almost nobody predicted that there would be this huge revival of traditions, and it goes back 2 or 3 decades, and whereby Confucian, which was thought to be dead. I mean, there were books called like The Last Confucian, and this tradition came back, and it's not just driven by the government, but by intellectuals and by people at large in society. And so to the point now that the government itself recognizes that its legitimacy, frankly, owes a lot to this much older tradition, Confucianism, which had been attacked for much for much of the Communist Party's existence, but earlier than that as well. So it's quite a fascinating development that starting from, let's say, the 1990s, this tradition has made a huge comeback to the point that it's endorsed both by, to a certain extent, by the government, also by independent intellectuals, and that it has huge and consciously so influence in society at large. Now, it's part of a larger trend in its revival of different traditions, including Buddhism and Taoism. But the main political tradition in Chinese history, and of course now as well, is Confucianism. Yeah.
Did I hear you? That makes both perfect sense, and it's because I'm familiar with your writings. I'm a little bit familiar with this still. But did I hear you? Did I hear you correct there? Did you say the legitimacy of the Communist Party is now to some extent based on new Confucianism, on Confucian sentiments in the population?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a view that, of course, it's still officially a Marxist political system, but Marxism is not a sufficient source of, let's call it, values-based legitimacy anymore. I mean, it's still an important source, but there's a view that the communist, political system is actually the latest iteration of a much older political system, which was strongly influenced by the Confucian tradition. And so now there's a much more conscious effort to trace this lineage to Chinese imperial history in terms of institutions, in terms of values, to this much older Confucian tradition, which has at least a 2,500-year-old history.
This is interesting because, of course, the Communist Party leaves space for new Confucianism. There are Confucian influences in contemporary Chinese political culture. So hence there are also indirect influence of this political culture, this Confucianism on, and this new Confucianism on this Communist Party. But now there's a third factor there, or there's a third dimension. It's actually part of the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself in contemporary China. Is this legacy? Okay, that's very interesting.
But I want to emphasize that it's not, the revival of Confucianism is not only driven by the state. It also is driven certain extent by independent intellectuals and by let's just say by common people. I mean, just to give you one example, there's this festival called the Grave Sweeping. Not so much festival. It's a 1 day per year where you're supposed to sweep graves to honor your ancestors, and that is, part to the extent that Confucianism is a religion, you're supposed to pay respect to your ancestors, and that was to the point that tens of millions of Chinese took the day off for that grave sweeping a day, and then the government just said, well, never, we decided, fine, not just we, as the government decided, let's just make it into national holiday. So it was driven by at the bottom, and then the government kind of reacted in response to that. So and that's one example. And if you go to bookstores in China today, you would see so many books about the Confucian tradition in a way that would have been remarkable even 30 years ago. So, and these are books written by independent intellectuals, some of whom are affiliated with the government, but some of whom are not. So it's a very diverse and robust debate about interpretations of Confucianism as well. That is, again, not driven solely by the government.
Yeah. So it comes from the top. It comes from the bottom. It comes from it siphons out of the pores of Chinese culture, Chinese life. What has new Confucianism done to the structure and the dynamism of China's intellectual field? Because I can imagine, like, if you would hypothetically think new Confucianism and the revival of traditionalist thought in Chinese political life and intellectual life, if we would remove those, as a thought experiment, and would only have different variants of Marxism-Leninism or Maoism or reformism, Dengist reformism facing off against each other, it would be a much more impoverished landscape. So it must add a lot of dynamism that you have a field now in which you have like two large ideological families, socialism and New Confucianism.
Yeah, so because Marxism is the official value system in China, to a certain extent, there's less room for alternative interpretations and, frankly, even for creative thinking. But the fact that Confucianism has a somewhat indirect influence, and there's no yet officially recognized interpretation, so it's a very dynamic intellectual field, and again, which for independent intellectuals who want the freedom to express their views, Confucianism is a kind of allows for that in a way, frankly, that the Marxist tradition may not to the same extent. Yeah,
and it's also that the fact that you have these two poles in the intellectual landscape also allows intellectuals to mix them up in creative ways. Because what my impression is that a lot of Chinese scholars creatively reassemble elements from Marxism and Confucianism.
Yeah, well, so both traditions answer different needs, right? I mean, the communist ideal ultimately is a society where advanced machinery does a socially necessary work, and then humans are free to realize their creative talents. And so that's one reason why the Marxist tradition, actually, which was also more or less not, I'm taking back a bit what I said just now, where I'm saying that there's not much room for interpretation. Actually, the Marxist tradition also, to a certain extent, is being revived in creative ways, partly because of the development of AI, which allows for thinking about the realization of this higher communist ideal where advanced machinery would do the socially necessary work, and then people are free to realize their creative talents, as opposed to in capitalist societies where people work to make money. But in a Marxist view, work would be life's prime want, and then we could realize our creative talents. And then that is a deep need for many people. But Confucianism has this other a vision of the good life, which is that we realize ourselves through nourishing harmonious and humane social relations. So it responds to this deep need for human social connection. So they both traditions, in some sense, respond to different human needs. So the Marxist tradition, this need for creative work, which can be individualistic, right? I mean, I could be a scientist working in my office without dealing with other people, and I could realize myself in a Marxist way. But the Confucians say the way to realize yourself is through social connections, starting with a family, and then friends, and then through members of the community, and eventually the world at large, and even the animal world. So the both traditions are being revived, and partly because they respond to different human needs. And there is room for creative work, for thinking about how that could be reconciled. And I think it's still an ongoing process. But yeah, but again, there are substantial differences, and I don't think they could ever be fully reconciled because they respond to different human needs. One is the need for creative work, and the other is the need for human social connection.
Yeah, of course, these traditions come from very different time periods and very different cultural worlds. But it's interesting that there's a retro thing going on in the Marxist tradition at the same time, because of course this Marxism of advanced machinery will allow us to focus on leisure and self-actualization is the original Marxism, whereas the Marxism that appeared in China in the mid 20th century was very Leninist. So that was that's a retro move within Marxism. That's nice, and we have a retro move.
But remember, the Leninist view, it's meant to be ultimately, in the Marxist theory of history, you have to have once you overthrow capitalism, you have a temporary stage where there's this dictatorship of the proletariat and it sounds a bit sinister, to put down the remnants of the bourgeoisie. But then you're supposed to move to society where the state is abolished. And so that because people are equal, have the opportunity to realize their creative talents, and advanced machinery does socially necessary work, and there's no more need anymore for creative state. So the Leninist view, according to the Marxist theory of history, is supposed to be kind of temporary. It's not meant to be permanent. That said, that's not going to happen because, Marx himself, he was in the 19th century, obviously, and he couldn't anticipate the possibility that machines would become so advanced that they could threaten, that could pose an existential threat to human beings, right? I mean, now we could think of AI becoming so smart that they could treat us as insects and make us our slaves instead of the other way around. Also, he couldn't anticipate the possibility of climate change, where again, there's a need for a state to deal with that, or how to regulate nuclear weapons, or how to deal with pandemics. So the state is not going to wither away. And this is something that Marx couldn't anticipate. So there's always going to be a need for a strong and capable state. The question is, how can we select and promote public officials who have above average ability and virtue, and who could try to promote policies that promote the well-being of people, and promote the well-being of people in the long term, including future generations, including the whole world ultimately. And that's where the Confucian tradition has a lot to offer, in a way that the Marxist tradition, and even frankly the liberal tradition, does not have a lot to say about. That is, how to train and promote public-spirited public officials.
I have the matching quote from your latest book, The Dean of Shandong, which, by the way, let me hold it up as a prop. I've got this nice prop. It's available in bookstores and on Amazon. And I also want to say, before I go on towards the audience, that please just drop your questions in the question and answer box. And then if they're topical, I can just ask them on behalf of you. And then after the interview part, there will be Q&A. Then you can post your questions, and then you will try to answer them. And if you want to ask them without being on the screen, you can just leave your question there. You can write it down, but you can also in the Q&A join us, and I will make you a panelist, and you will just join. That would be the most fun. If some of the members in the audience, sometimes people are a bit shy, but it would be lovely if some of the people would join us in the Q&A. So start thinking about your questions, audience. And for you, Daniel, I have the matching quote from your latest book. You write, quote, "The right question is how to increase the likelihood that public officials will effectively serve the public interest, and how to decrease the likelihood that public resources will be misappropriated for private interests. Here, the Marxist tradition has almost nothing to offer, and neither does the liberal tradition." That's interesting. Neither does the liberal tradition. So New Confucianism is something that enriches political thought in China, but it can also enrich political thought in the West.
Yeah, well, I think that's true in principle, but I'm not very confident that people outside of, let's say, cultures that have a Confucian heritage are very open to learning from Confucian insights. So you have different kinds of Confucian philosophers in China, some of whom, like his name is Bai Tongdong. He has a very good book called, I don't like the title, Against Political Equality, but basically he defends a kind of Confucian vision, which he thinks is a universal vision of an ideal society, of an ideal political society, which is partly democratic and partly meritocratic. And he thinks that this could serve as a standard for the whole world. My view is much more grounded in a particular culture and history. And I think that just as a practical matter, if you're not from this culture or history, if you're not somebody like me, maybe I'm not born in China, but I've been here for decades, and it's taken a long time to learn and to appreciate the idea that this could be exported abroad is just very odd. Just to give you one simple example, I'm from Canada, right? And you're from the Netherlands. And in the post-World War II, we're kind of, it's almost like a mother's milk that we think there's only one kind of legitimate political system, and that's where the political leaders are chosen by means of one person, one vote. and all the other alternatives are kind of authoritarian and somehow lack legitimacy. To question that, I mean, I could do it intellectually, but to really emotionally allow for the possibility that there could be legitimate alternatives took like literally decades of like racking my head, against a wall. And finally, because I was at Tsinghua University, which, as you know, which trains many of the political leaders in China, and I was there for a long time. And then I realized my colleagues are talking about this really interesting question: how could we train and promote public officials so that they have this public virtue and public spiritedness? And then I realized, well, there's a really fascinating issue here, of course it has a much deeper history as well. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something interesting here, and it's and only then did I think, well, maybe I really should take it seriously. And eventually, I wrote a book trying to make systematic sense of this ideal, which we call political. Not we, I mean, it's a longer history. Political meritocracy, 贤能政治 in Chinese. But the idea of promoting it outside of China or outside of a country which has a Confucian heritage, I am not very optimistic that it could have any effect whatsoever. Yeah.
And then let's go to your core mission, which is promoting New Confucianism and strengthening New Confucianism in China, and explaining this experiment or this undertaking towards Western audience, because you always had this double role where you're promoting New Confucianism in China, but China has 1.3 billion people, and they may not need necessarily a Canadian professor to help them appreciate the power of New Confucianism. But your special role has always been to simultaneously explain what is happening on the ground, so to speak, towards English-speaking audiences. So let's go to your mission. You arrived 20 years ago in Beijing. You already an enthusiastic New Confucian, transitioning out of communitarianism, which was your original guiding light, and you go to the prestigious Tsinghua University. You're going to educate in a Confucian style the future leaders of China in this very prestigious college, which is arguably more difficult for a Chinese person to get into Tsinghua or Beida than it is for an American to get into Harvard or Princeton. So you're there with the creme de la creme, and you write in 2008 book The New Confucianism. I'm wondering, what was your mission then, and is it the exact same mission that you have today? So now in 2023, so most recently, you wrote New Confucianism is a remedy, quote, to modernity's tendency to cause atomism and psychological anxiety. And you say it fills the moral vacuum. Is that still that's at the heart of your mission today? Was that already was that the core mission also in the early 2000s?
Okay, so it's a great point, but I'm not sure I like the word mission, because it sounds like mission and missionary, and my main one thing about being inspired by Confucianism is that one is humble, and you're always learning from other people, right? One of the most famous sayings in the Analects of Confucius is that in a group of three, there's always one who's going to be my teacher. But of course, I mean, I need to recognize that I have some normative kind of ideals that motivate me, and that I don't deny that if I would be happy if others not so much endorse, but were willing to take them seriously. I guess in what happened when as you mentioned, I did my doctoral thesis on communitarianism. That was at Oxford, and there I was quite sympathetic to communitarianism. But then my first job was in Singapore when people were arguing about Asian values, which I thought was a pretty empty concept. But that's when I started learning about Confucianism, and Confucianism had similar ideas as communitarianism, meaning that the good life lies in social relations, and we should try to nourish and promote humane social relations. But it had for one thing, it had a much longer and diverse history, and it wasn't just an offshoot of liberalism, but it had certain issues like it's through rituals that we develop a sense of community. That's not part of the kind of Western communitarian tradition. And also the importance of securing harmonious social relations. And the Chinese idea of harmony is like it's diversity and harmony. We respect pluralism, but given all this difference, we try to make something more beautiful out of that. And also the idea of political meritocracy, that we need to train public officials with superior ability and virtue. All those issues were not part of the Western communitarian tradition. And that made me decide, wow, there's something really fascinating here. And that's really what made me kind of motivated to learn more about the Confucian tradition. So at some point, maybe I became not just a learner, but a teacher. And it was a great honor. So when I was at Tsinghua University, yes, I was happy to teach future leaders. But I was also trying to understand what my colleagues were saying and what leaders were saying in Beijing and how to make systematic sense of this idea of political meritocracy. But it's only when I was given this job when I was given the opportunity to serve as dean at Shandong University that I could really said, wow, now I could have a bit of maybe some form of power where I could implement some of these ideas. But I learned quite quickly to become even more modest, that it wasn't just because the idea of being a dean, I thought I could shape things, but then I realized, well, even then, my ideas became I became much more modest in my aspirations. For one thing, there was collective leadership, and it wasn't just me who could decide things. In Chinese, we say, the dean, like Yuan Zhang, shuo le suan. Actually, it's not that simple at all. We had 4 vice-deans, 3 party secretaries, and we had to discuss every single thing for hours and hours before making a decision. And I realized that this is much more common practice than I thought. It's not just collective leadership at higher levels of government, but you have it throughout the whole political system, for better or worse. And it has advantages because some really bad ideas can be rejected through this process of deliberation, but it has some disadvantages too, that it takes a long time to make decisions and not always in an efficient way, maybe.
Yeah. So one of the beautiful things about your book, The Dean of Shandong, is that you, in a self-deprecatory way, report on your experiences and your difficulties serving as a dean in a very, very different cultural context. And you're also imitating and following the Confucian tradition there, because of course being self-critical is very central to being a good Confucian. So in a Confucian style, you criticize your own Confucian engagement as you say these are confessions of a minor bureaucrat at the Chinese university. And yeah, so when you went to Qingdao, yeah, it was you toughened up a bit there. It was a challenge, and it was more of a challenge than you anticipated before you went there. But you came really with a dream, because Shandong is of course the province of where Confucius is from, and it's also where the Jisha Academy was located, where Xunzi and Mencius studied and taught in certain moments in their lives.
Yeah, so Shandong is the home province of basically the ground zero for Confucian culture. And Kongzi, Confucius himself, he was born near Qufu, and the party secretary of the new Qingdao campus or Shandong University himself was named Kong, which in Chinese is the descendant of Confucius or Kong himself. He was a 76th generation descendant. There's a very long family tree, and part of the reason he hired me was to, even though he was a party secretary of the Communist Party, was to promote Confucianism, as well as also to help the university internationalize. So it seemed like a pretty good fit. And I realized that the best way to promote Confucianism is, first of all, is to hire good teachers who can do it well, and that means at the university level, not just having good knowledge of the tradition, but being able to engage to motivate students and to engage with their emotions and to identify the particularities of each student. I mean, that's the model of Confucius himself. He would sometimes give different, seemingly opposite points of advice to different students. That's because he was addressing each student in their particularity. And at the time, the Confucians were arguing with other traditions, legalists and Moists and Taoists. And there was this institute, as you mentioned, before in the Warring States period, called the Jixia Xuegong, the Jixia Academy, where you would have these very lively debates between Confucians and other traditions. And if that, so you mentioned the dream, if that sort of academy could be reestablished, and recently, by the way, they found the actual site of that academy, so they could, theoretically, it could be rebuilt. Just imagine in 20 years from now, if there could be this rebuilt academy where there could be diverse and open debates between Confucians and others. And of course, Confucianism itself is a very diverse tradition. That would be a beautiful way of making students and intellectuals engage with the Confucian tradition again. But as you know from the book itself, I mean, one of the disappointments, frankly, of the past few years is that there's been a tightening of the intellectual space, and there's been increased censorship. And even that my book itself, it's been translated in Hong Kong, which shows that we have much more academic freedom here, but it has yet to be accepted by any publisher in mainland China, even though I'm like as sympathetic as you could be compared to like any other person born in the West, and I deliberately tried to criticize the demonization of China and to show that we have a very humane and often humorous ways of dealing with people. But even my book has yet to be accepted as a publication in Chinese in mainland China. I regret the report.
Yeah, yeah. No, I just wanted to say that I'm a great admirer of your public intellectualism, also because there's a beautiful tragic dimension to it, because you as you say, you have this complexity to your critical engagement, where on the one hand you're trying to target and criticize demonizations and one-sided accounts of the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese governance, Chinese political thought. And many in the West misunderstand that as you being an apologist for the Chinese Communist Party. Whereas in fact, you are you're pushing for new Confucianism, which is not orthodox Marxism, and you, in all of your publications, you have critical side notes. And it's really funny how you do this, because usually you say, well, I want to defend China against this outrageous one-sided account, but it's just this little thing and that little thing that's not right, and there's also this, and then actually it stacks up to quite some really fundamental criticism. So I would just give you a few quotes here. So you've been optimistic about this new Confucian revival. You say that the CCP has moved closer to officially embracing Confucianism. But you also say the Confucian comebacks seem to have stalled of late. And you mention, quote, repressive trends. You in a recent paper that you wrote, where you pretended to be, it is funny, you pretended to be ChatGPT 88 writing in 2050. So you pretended to be the chatbot, an artificial intelligence program in 2050 reflecting on China. And in there you write about the present. In 2025, there was strong support for the political system due to measures that curbed corruption, reduced pollution, and alleviated poverty. But intellectuals felt stifled by increased repression. From 2025 to 2035, known as China's lost decade, China's economy worsened and relations with the US further deteriorated, nearly leading to war. And in a statement that is, I think, really typifies your critical habitus, is you write, I clearly hope. Sorry, you write. You write, for example. Wait, sorry, I have a different quote now. So you say you oppose academic censorship and the overly heavy censorship in journalism and academia and in Chinese political life and in the elitism at the Communist Party elite and the intransparency at the top. And you write, for example, quote, I clearly hope that China can learn from the norms of academic and media freedom in the West. And you also in your book identify yourself as a critic of the CCP, but there's immediate caveat. You also see positive things to build on, and you do not favor overthrowing the whole system. So you're a nuanced critic. I think what really typifies your mode of criticism, you're in China, you have skin in the game. It's coming from you're well-intentioned, constructive, but you don't dance around the sensitive topics. You do address sensitive topics, and you do publish and publicly speak on very, very sensitive topics, offering very fundamental criticisms. And one particular statement I thought was very interesting is where you said that it's actually the demonization of the Chinese Communist Party is furthering repressive trends in China. So yes, you are criticizing the demonization of the Chinese Communist Party, but you're also acknowledging that the way this is doing damage is exactly by strengthening repressive trends in Chinese political system at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so when for example, the U.S. government openly argues that China is its main enemy, and it seeks to encircle China with military bases and do all it can to curb China's economic, especially technological development, obviously that strengthens the forces in China that favor focusing first and foremost on security and not allowing for expression of alternative viewpoints. So it's this vicious cycle. So in this article, which frankly is a partly self-parody as well, but I do think that not just because of China's internal development, but because of external developments, I hope I'm wrong, but in the next few years, things will become very bad. My hope is that we can get through the next few years without going to war. And at that point, I think that we can move on to it seems so obvious that on issues like, climate change and regulation of AI and regulation of nuclear weapons, that both China and US and the whole world would benefit from cooperation. But I think until we get to that point, we need to go through a very bad. It's quite likely that we'll go through a very bad period.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, it sounds rather ominous, especially the prospect of war. There's extreme hostility in American public life towards China, and there are all these very very crude prejudices. So what would you say are the main prejudices that you can easily dispel when you're as an academic working in China? So you've been in Beijing, you worked in Qingdao, now you're in Hong Kong. So you've seen how things operate. You know that there's too much censorship, but you also know that that there is much more intellectual life and there are much more opportunities than people imagine. So what are some easy to dispel, quick to dispel prejudices from the West about Chinese intellectual life?
Well, one is that it's a totalitarian country where people are kind of forced to think and act in the same way. China is so diverse, and not just the differences between the countryside and the cities, but even between different cities. It's incredibly diverse, and there's actually a very lively intellectual scene and diverse, notwithstanding the censorship. and especially now in private settings, I mean, people are completely frank and super self-critical as well. And there's much more knowledge in China of the West than of the other way around. I mean, the Chinese intellectuals are very, very, know a lot of the national news is quite censored, but international news in China is relatively open. And so people are very much aware of what goes on outside of China. And whereas in the US or Canada, where I'm from, frankly, the knowledge of China is embarrassingly bad. So that's one thing. And the idea that China wants to expand its territory, I mean, beyond Taiwan, of course, Taiwan is viewed as part of China, but I expect in the next few decades, if the mainland China becomes a more open and society, so to speak, I think it'll become much more attractive for unification. And let's just assume that there's a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. The idea that China wants to expand beyond that is ridiculous. I mean, China will never want to, take over, like Korea or Japan in a way that, that Western powers might, like, for example, I mean, I don't want to criticize, what's happening in the U.S. now, but in a way that other powers might want. I mean, once China reunifies with Taiwan, that'll be it, for China. It's focusing on China's development, for its and well-being for its people, and hopefully some cooperation with other powers to deal with global challenges like climate change. That's nothing's gonna happen beyond that. I mean, why would China be a threat to like Canada or the US? I mean, it's just bewildering to me. Why would people think that? But maybe I'm missing something.
Well, for me, it's always so funny when Americans go on a when they go on a rampage about China and they warn you for all the dangerous things that China is doing, and then clearly showing clearly projecting themselves and and certain imperial Western traditions onto China. So, for example, I was laughing about this with a politician from Somalia, and he said, "Well, we have these Westerners here, and they come to us Africans, and they say, oh, yeah, we heard that the Chinese are trying to expand their power over Africa. They're trying to, maybe they want to colonize you. Maybe they pretend that they just want to do some business and win-win, but maybe they really want to like control you or something." It's like we didn't, so we were both laughing because we didn't have to explain anything, because like, white people, Europeans and Americans, coming to Africa, saying like, look out for those people. They may want to colonize you. Given the historical context, it's a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, China has not gone to war since 1979, right? And there's no reason why. I mean, they know that, if there is war, it would destroy China's economic prospects for decades, if not destroy the whole world. So I mean, and not only that, but
yeah, although may I say that has been argued just before many big wars happened, right? That the fact that it's absolutely ridiculous and makes no sense at all to proceed with the war doesn't mean a war is not going to happen. I mean,
yeah, no, things could change for the worse unexpectedly, and that's theoretically possible. But I think it's highly unlikely unless there's a direct provocation. For example, if the U.S. were to formally declare that Taiwan is an independent country, I mean, that would be viewed as a cause for war. But unless there's that sort of direct provocation, I don't expect a war. Of course,
yeah, because your chat, yeah, your chat bot, which is your through which you make your predictions in this humorous paper. By the way, congratulations on even being able to publish such papers. Like, I have a lot of difficulties publishing papers, and but you can just publish like papers where you pretend to be a chatbot from 2050. I think that's just spectacular. Very funny. Yeah, but your chatbot actually, after the lost decade, things become better, because ChatGPT 88 writes the next 15 years. Oh, sorry. After the 15 bad years, there is the golden age, which sees unparalleled prosperity, an open and pluralistic political system, the setting up of the East Asian Union, and sustained cooperation with the USA to deal with global challenges. So, how is this going to unfold in Chinese politics, and what is the contribution of New Confucianism?
Well, again, I think it would take something quite bad to happen for. I do view the problem more on the Western side and the American side. I mean, I do think that the Chinese would be willing to collaborate on issues like climate change or even navigation of the seas. I mean, and it would take and I think it will happen next few years. I mean, I kind of half jokingly predict this Miami tsunami that would flood Miami and even Mar-a-Lago. And that point, the U.S. politicians would realize we do need to seriously cooperate with China to deal with this existential challenge of climate change. So if that happens, then I do think that we can allow for a more optimistic and realistic predictions of a desirable future. And so the communist part is that AI, if it develops in a way that serves people rather than the other way around, it could allow for this society where most of the socially necessary work is done by advanced machinery, and then people are free to realize their creative talents. And the Confucian contribution is that how there would still be a need to select and promote officials with superior ability and virtue. And the Confucian tradition has a lot to offer in terms of which virtues matter, which abilities matter, how do we assess virtues and abilities, what's the relation between abilities and virtues. I mean, there's hundreds of years of discussion about this in the Confucian tradition. And also how to deal with social conflicts which are not going to go away. I mean, the Confucians have a lot about how we resort first and foremost on mediation, which allows for the certain extent, if done well, for the restoration of harmonious relations before relations are broken down. So this idea that we should rely first on mediation and with legal punishment as a last resort, that's central to the Confucian tradition. I mean, there's different ways in which the Confucian emphasis on the family as a source of human well-being. I mean, that's not going to go away, and the Confucians have a lot to offer in that respect as well. So I discuss all that in this kind of, as you suggest, essay, which is partly it's partly humorous but partly serious. Yeah.
Well, you use the humor to be able to make serious points, because you need, if you would just march in and say, here's my future, here's my prediction. I mean, of course, you and the reader will be well aware that the details of the predictions are unlikely to happen. But that's not the point. You want to sketch the moment in history where we find ourselves. I have a good question from an audience member, namely from my Swedish friend Jens Mikael Klinteskog, who asks, what are the sources of New Confucianism? Are these old classical texts or primarily social practices derived from the past? And I think to that question I would add, which are the standard New Confucian texts? Because of course, New Confucianism as a form of Confucianism is focused on classical texts, but there are also New Confucian authors which may or may not play an important role in the New Confucian tradition, because New Confucianism is not Neo-Confucianism, and it's also not the traditional Confucianism of the early empire, and it's also not the most original Confucianism of Confucius's time. So there's the question: what are the sources? And of course, the Jens already implied that it's likely to also involve social practices carried through culture.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, the sources are, of course, Confucianism is a tradition that seeks inspiration from the classics. And those are, for example, on the national university exams, the Gaokao. Now the students have to learn parts of the Analects of Confucius, parts of the Mencius, the Mengzi, and book one of the Xuanzi. So some of the great Confucian classics are literally memorized by every student who wants to write the examinations to go on to university. I mean, that's one way in which the kind of modernized way in which the examinations are used to promote or to ideas from the Confucian classics. That's one way. Also in schools now, more and more in primary schools and secondary schools, you have classics that are not just the very early part, but also you have, for example, there's one text called in Chinese the Di Zi Gui, which is a Qing Dynasty text, which tells young children how to be filial to their parents. And that's taught in millions of young students now in primary schools. And it's a very interesting text. And it has a very nuanced view of filiality. I mean, this Confucianism is very often vulgarized in practice, right? I mean, it's just like, you have vulgar Marxism, vulgar liberalism, vulgar Christianity, and so on. So the vulgarized Confucianism is you should blindly obey your parents, but that's really a vulgarized tradition. But the Di Zi Gui has a much more nuanced view about the obligations of filiality, which we can define as care and reverence for elderly parents and ancestors. And they say, for example, if your parent does something wrong, what should you do? Well, then they say, well, this is addressed to like 7 or 8-year-old kids, say, well, you should criticize them. And what if that doesn't work? Well, then you should wait till your parent is in a good mood and then try again. And what if that doesn't work? Well, then you cry and you work on their emotions. So it's a very detailed view of how to engage with this issue of what do you do with a parent who does something morally bad. So my point is that you have texts from the whole tradition, which is very diverse, which are taught in primary schools, secondary schools, and universities now to a much greater extent than before. That's one way in which the sources are being transmitted. But as the question suggested, it's also a matter of social practices. And I already mentioned this idea of worship for ancestors, which was practiced by tens of millions of people, and eventually it was made into a national holiday, precisely because it was so widely practiced. And the idea too of just when the idea of care and reverence for elderly parents and ancestors, how does that work? Well, it works out every day when you have meals in China. Again, it's a round table, right? It's communal dishes, unlike in the West where we eat kind of individually. And typically in a family, the elderly people would eat first, and you would wait till they have the first bite. So it's a way of learning through social practice about this care and respect for elderly parents. This is one way in which the social practices inform everyday life. Shandong province, which again, it's 100 million people, so it's not like it's bigger than any European country in terms of population. There's conscious pride about the Confucian tradition, which takes the form. So every time we have, I discuss this a little bit in the book, but also in an earlier book, The Just Hierarchy, where every time we have formal meals, or even sometimes not so formal meals, the seating arrangements are quite hierarchical. And typically those who are more elderly or with more social status would eat first. But then they would have to give a toast to everybody. And then eventually everybody in the table participates in these toasting and eating practices, and a strong sense of community and care among participants develops. And this is so common in Shandong province, or even things like, Shandong Airlines, above every seat, there's a quote from the Analects of Confucius, which again, very, very concrete way in which these social practices are transmitted. And so in the rest of China, the typical lucky number is number 8 because it's a homonym, it sounds like wealth. But in Shandong province, it's the number 7 because there's expression, qi shang ba xia, which means when you're 57 years old, if you're a public official, you still have hope of being promoted. But when you're 58, that's it. You're on the way to retirement. So so number 7 is a lucky number. In your offices, you would want to have an office with number 7. Your telephone number, more 7s. And so this is the way in which the social practice is. The Confucian ideal is you strive to be a public official because that's the way to do the maximum number of good to promote well-being, and it's very, very central in Shandong province in a way which is less so. So I mean, so again, Confucianism it's meant to be a universal ethic, but frankly, it's centered in Qufu, is kind of the home ground of Confucianism. And the more you go away from Qufu, the less kind of the social practices are important. So here I'm in Hong Kong, and the Confucian social practices are there, but it's less obvious and certainly less consciously articulated than they would be in Shandong. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is very clear depiction of the wide-ranging and socially embedded character of Confucianism. We have a lot of we have quite a large audience, and we have some more questions. My friend Robin, actually, he's Dutch and American, and he asks. He's responding to the comment you made earlier, or this is in relation to this relates to the comment you made earlier, where you said there's of course there's vulgar New Confucianism, just like you have vulgar Marxism, and you can have some vulgarized or a radicalized or extreme version or bastardized version of any ideology. So he said, New Confucianism in itself seems to promote living in justice and morality. However, the Chinese government only seems to embrace New Confucianism when it suits them to promote societal harmony, showing aggression and cracking down on dissidents whenever possible. Can we conclude that this is akin to corporations embracing sustainability in the form of greenwashing? Isn't the CCP conducting New Confucianism washing? And I do think immediately we can clarify one thing. I think Robin is a little bit confused about the word harmony here, because in harmony, as you mentioned earlier, Daniel, it means harmony and diversity. So he means it's he butong. It's you're harmonious, not the same. So it's not, there's this sense of uniformizing, homogenizing in the English word harmonization, which is not in the Chinese. In the Chinese, it's about being peaceful in diversity.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes things are lost in translation. I mean, I remember watching the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. And this character, He, which is translated as harmony, was held to be this is what we mean to represent Chinese culture. If we have to choose one character, this is the character that was chosen. And I was listening to the American journalist reporting, wow, look at that. It's like all these soldiers marching in unison. That's what they mean by, that's what they're promoting. But for Chinese, like every intellectual, every student knows this saying from the Analects of Confucius. It just says "har butong," which means that you should promote this diversity and harmony, but not sameness, not uniformity, and not conformity. And so the idea, the Confucian idea of harmony, which is the one that's known to people, is really respecting and almost celebrating diversity and pluralism. And within that pluralism, the question is, how can we deal with that pluralism in a way that is peaceful and nonviolent, and that somehow allows for the creation of something that is more beautiful? That's the Confucian idea of harmony. So yes, sometimes it can be misused in practice. In the name of harmony, you would want to, promote the sameness and uniformity, but that's a clear distortion. So, but I want to say that in the Chinese tradition, there's two main political traditions which have had great influence throughout history. And one is a Confucian tradition, which typically promotes for what we would today call soft power, ruled by soft power, ruled by moral example, ruled by informal rituals that promote community, versus this legalist or Fajia tradition, which says that in your times of chaos, the only way to have social order is to have strong laws that make people fear punishment, and those should be applied ruthlessly without any exception. And those traditions have been in constant tension. So when we see things like repression that seems worrisome to us, arguably that owes much more to the legacy of this legalist tradition rather than the Confucian tradition. And this is not going to go away, this tension.
We have a more technical expert level question from Zhu Kefu, who is himself doing research into Taoist and neo-traditionalist thinking in contemporary China, and he asks. So this is a more difficult, more complex question, but he asks, how do you differentiate your concept of New Confucianism from the earlier New Confucianism led by scholars like Mo Zhongshan? While the earlier movement developed in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the version of New Confucianism promoted by the Communist Party appears distinct. How do you account for these differences? In Confucianism, does rule by the worthy and the capable genuinely cultivate government officials with public virtues and spiritual integrity? Or, if I may be cynical, could these so-called public virtues and spirituality merely serve as disguises for corruption and self-interest? In contemporary times, might rule by the worthy and the capable function less as a means of moral cultivation and more as sophisticated training in concealment. So it's much more. This is a very academically high level, a very academic high level question, but at the same time, it goes a bit in the direction that Robin was also going towards, namely the genuineness of it all.
Yeah, so there's the New Confucianism again. It's just a label of it's just a book title, right? But and it's not just so you in the recent revival of Confucianism, before it had a big impact in mainland China, as the questioner suggested, you had in Hong Kong and Taiwan and even in the US, you had a revival of Confucianism, which was more academic and more non-political, where basically these thinkers, including Mo Zhongshan, they argue that Confucianism has a lot to offer for family and everyday ethics. But when it comes to politics, we should be liberal Democrats or even like Western-style liberal Democrats. But then it's not so much the Communist Party. You had independent intellectuals, like most famously this thinker called Jiang Qing, and he differentiated between these kind of Taiwan slash people who are outside of China who developed this view of this kind of apolitical view of Confucianism versus what he called political Confucians. These are Confucians who thinks that the Confucian ethics should have political impact and it should influence the way that we think about politics, and that we shouldn't just think of politics as, we need to have Western-style liberal democracy, but we should have political institutions and practices that are strongly influenced by Confucian ethics, including this idea of having more meritocratic selection of political leaders. That was a view by an independent intellectual who's frankly completely marginalized now in China. Now, to the extent that Confucianism is promoted by when people say the Communist Party and it's all cynical, like it's this organization of 100 million people. When I hear about this party being this way, all I see is a bafflingly complex bureaucracy with so many competing tendencies. You have some good people, some bad people, and most of whom are partly good, partly bad. And I know many leaders within this organization who are sincerely committed to Confucian ethics, and others who use it in a more cynical way. And of course, there's a lot of corruption in the Chinese political system, but over the past 10 years, there's been this effort to deal with it, for better or worse. I think my own view, for what it's worth, is that as I mentioned in this book recently, that the anti-corruption drive probably has gone on much too long and it's relied too much on legalist methods. And there's a need to move from this kind of fear of punishment to some sort of moral self-regulation. And this transition hasn't quite happened yet to the extent that one might hope. So of course, there's always a huge gap between the ideal and the practice. The question is how to minimize that gap. And yes, I mean, it's good to be cynical and to point out misuses, but it doesn't mean that we should forgive or that we should forsake the possibility that ideals still matter in politics, and that we should try to move closer to those ideals, and even that there are leaders who are partly good. I mean, I know some of them, and one of the things in this book is that I dealt with leaders, mid-level leaders, but who are very admirable, and who spend much of their working lives, working very hard for the good of the university and the good of the people around them. You know, I mean, why should it be so cynical, just dismissing it offhand? You know, I'm sorry, I don't partake of that view.
But so you can hold ideals in more or less genuine ways, but the point of an ideal is always that it doesn't exactly coincide with reality, because then it wouldn't be the ideal. In a Hegelian dialectic, as soon as the ideal is manifests in reality, it's aufgehoben. The ideal disappears because, of course, ideals always float above reality. It's what you're striving towards. If they're manifested completely perfectly, then they can no longer be your ideal.
Sure, but the aim is to minimize the gap between the reality and the ideal,
Yes.
right?
You're always trying to minimize that gap. But so a good ideal is maybe not too far, but not too close, and it depends on the circumstances. But there will always be the tension. There will always be the tension between the reality that falls short of the ideal and the ideal, which is not. Which doesn't mean that the people holding those ideals are not holding those ideals genuinely. So Jens is also arguing about this. So he's about the or more practically minded. So he asked as well. Jens also asked about the Confucianism in Taiwan and overseas. But I think you covered it. I think there's more ethical exclusion. There's this kind of Confucianism which is ethical in a very individualistic and more politics excluding way, and then there's political Confucianism, which of course is also ethical, but tries to have the ethics embedded in a broader political view. And you're clearly a political Confucian, and probably you're one of the few non-Chinese political Confucians, right? Because the people who are Western academics who've been interested in Confucianism through the last, let's say, half century, have often chosen the non-political variant. And you are different because you are of the political variant, non-Chinese, but of the political variant and in China. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less, yeah. I mean, I guess obviously I'm not the only one, but there is a tendency for people in the West who are sympathetic to Confucianism as a kind of ethic of everyday life, which isn't necessarily individualistic. I mean, it could be family oriented, but that when it comes to thinking about political institutions, they're not really willing to take that step to think of alternatives to kind of liberal democracy. Yeah.
I have a question by Wodek Zemberg, or I probably mispronounced his first name. He asks, or he observes that the Marxist Confucian China ranking ranks China 65th on the Corruption Perception Index, but Lutheran Denmark is number one. So what does it say about the power of Confucian culture to curb corruption and shape the moral virtues of the political elite?
Well, look, the point is not that Confucianism is the only way of dealing with corruption in government. Of course, other traditions have a lot to contribute, and it's much easier to do in a small, homogeneous, and relatively wealthy country like Denmark.
I'm from one of those countries myself, the Netherlands. So I know it's always very easy to grab a statistic. These are countries that have been very, very wealthy as well for a long time, and of course have their own traditions, fighting corruption, and their own intellectual resources in this regard. And China is not. I mean, and perception indexes can also be deceptive because you never really know if people are just particularly critical or gullible, or you're actually measuring corruption. Because there's also this thing where Dutch people think that there is just no corruption in the Netherlands, which is a very gullible take. it may not reflect reality, but it's very hard to, you cannot hold the perception against the, so these kind of researches on corruption are very limited because you never really know if you're measuring actual differences in corruption levels between countries or areas, or just the degree to which a population is paranoid about corruption.
Yeah, and generally speaking, it's much easier to control corruption in small countries, which are more homogeneous and wealthy. I mean, if you compare China to large, plural and relatively poor countries like India or Indonesia or even Russia, I mean, China frankly comes off as not bad at all. Yeah, and maybe the Confucian tradition is part of the explanation for that.
So I see that there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of our audience members. I really like also for a sense of community that some people step forward and can I make a few people, if you're not too shy, can you please join our chat with your video and with your audio, because I like that at the end always. If some people show there, that it's not just the two speakers, but there's some people. Who can I please raise your hand if I can upgrade you, or maybe I'll just upgrade you and you just have to deny it if you. Oh, Jens wants to join. This is good. I don't have to force anyone. So Jens is my good friend from Beda. He's the Beda guy. Studied Chinese in Chengdu. There we. Yeah. Hey.
Hello.
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 Who can I? Mike, do you have more? Yes, you have more questions for. So I call him Mike, but he's also known as Jens. Do you have more questions for Daniel?
Oh, yes. Very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. I was wondering a little bit about.
By the way, Jens is a lecturer in law at Uppsala University.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering about some of these practical measures that you see the New Confucianism advocates for raising or educating virtuous officials.
Oh, so what are the practical ways? So, so just to give you an example, in Chufu, but actually in Shandong province as a whole, more or less now, if you are considered for promotion as a public official, they would interview the parents of the public official to ask the parents if their son or daughter who's being considered for promotion is filial. Again, the assumption is, Confucian assumption is that if it's an idea of graded love. You have to be first and foremost committed to love and caring and reverence for the family, and then you extend that beyond the family. But if you cannot be loving within the family, it's very hard to extend that love outside the family. So they would interview the parents of a public official who's being considered for promotion, and if the 80-year-old mother would say, my kid is really not that filial, it would have negative outcome and probably in terms of the likelihood of promotion. So this is one very concrete way in which Confucian ethics influences the political system in China.
Who's next? Mark. I think you had Mark Stahlman is here as well somewhere. I think you had a question, Mark.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm not an academic. I run a think tank called the Center for the Study of Digital Life. My partner in this was a high-level naval intelligence officer with China as his primary focus, and I believe Phil Midland still has an enormous role to play in the relationship, particularly between the U.S. and China. My question for you, based on a lot of research that we've done and others, is the role of Taoism in modern-day China. I'm sure you'd be among the first to agree that you've already described legalism and as as a contrary. But is it possible that Taoism is the more important contrary? I know that's not widely discussed amongst folks in the West who deal with this, but just to cite a couple of notes that may be helpful for your reply. As you know, it is commonly thought by many Chinese officials and intellectuals that history is a cyclical affair with a fairly long time cycle, roughly 700 years. Because Ming is problematic in many ways and isn't even a single dynasty, so to speak, Tong winds up being very often referred to, at least in the people that we deal with. And Tong, of course, had a fascinating relationship with Buddhism as well as, importantly, Taoism. As I understand it, it was required in Chang'an that everyone have a block printed copy of Tao Te Ching in their homes. So it was almost like the Bible in a Marriott or something like that. And to the extent that today people are thinking that this is the new Tong in so forth, then Taoism becomes very important. As you probably know, Xi Jinping's brother-in-law is a fascinating Taoist scholar, has largely reorganized the entire Taoist approach, published in English as well as in Chinese. So, and for better or worse, Taoism is the only one of these Chinese traditions that can deal with technology. So Needham's entire exercise, his decision to pick the Li family for his Chinese name, and so Science and Civilization in China, multi volumes, is all oriented towards the Taoist component, not the Confucian component. And he and his collaborators make a very good argument in that regard. Today's Chinese leadership has to be technologically, perhaps even more than ethically, oriented to the rest of the world. So how would you comment on the role of Taoism in today's China?
Yeah, well, that's I mean, a hugely complex and important question. And actually, at this moment now here at Hong Kong University, I'm doing this course called Why Ancient Chinese Political Theory Matters. And I look at the debates between the Confucians and legalists, as well as Confucians and Moists, as well as Confucians and Taoists. And the Taoists, I mean, personally, Zhuangzi is my favorite among the early, along the thinkers who came to be labeled as Taoists. And I mean, they're absolutely fascinating, some of the ideas, and very rich and diverse. But the emphasis is somewhat different. I mean, for Zhuangzi, it's really, to the extent that there's this idea of the good life, it lies from freeing oneself from social commitments. So not everybody can be a public official or wants to be a public official. And for those who have alternative views of the good life, Taoism has a lot to offer. What about politically, though? Well, I agree with you to a certain extent about Taoism technology, although I'd like to hear more about why you say that. I'm not sure that Confucians would be opposed to technological developments if they allow for example, for more family-based interaction. Like, for example, if there's a self-driving car that would allow, drivers to spend more time with family members instead of driving the car. I mean, I think Confucians would welcome that form of technology as well. I think where Taoism might have a lot to offer as well is regarding relations with nature. I mean, again, Confucianism has something to say about sustainability and not misusing resources if it has long-term environmental disastrous consequences. But there's something about the Taoist approach that views ourselves as more intimately part of nature, which arguably is a much more valuable way of thinking about the future. So certainly Taoism has a lot to offer. But when it comes to the selection and promotion of public officials, and other issues that are more perhaps dear to the Confucian, to political Confucianism. Maybe there's the Confucian tradition might have more to offer. So certainly I don't mean to, yeah, it's a great question and an issue that's worth pursuing. Yeah.
Well, to the extent that people today are focusing on events in China, it tends to be things like DeepSeek, it tends to be things like BYD, et cetera, that's in the Western press. So it is come now to be the case, which would certainly not have been true, as I've mentioned before on these. I first visited China to speak at a PLA-sponsored technology conference in 1997. So I'm very familiar with going to bookstores and trying to find English language versions of the Analects, and how difficult that was to do then. But now, as you know, if you go to Wang or elsewhere, you wind up with many shelves of both Taoism and Analects,
Right.
not legalism. You are not going to find a huge book section on legalism, but it's there. So I'm just saying here that in order to be a part, and maybe even a more successful than anybody had thought, particularly in the days when it was the World Trade Organization and so forth, and China seemed to be just falling in line. But they're not in line, obviously, and the not being in line is a technology-driven question, and you're not going to get much advice. The topic of inventions, the topics of spreading new technologies or competing globally for many of the other traditions other than Taoism, which is why I think it is particularly important now.
Thanks, Mark. Can I bring in my my Dutch friend, the philosopher Leonard Akkermans, who has been raising his hand in a rather modest Confucian way, not making a sound, being all humble. Where are you, Leonard?
Yes, maybe I'm secretly a Confucian all this time. So thanks. This has been very interesting. My question is whether China can avoid some of the pitfalls that non-democratic countries often face. And I'm thinking particularly about concentrating power being concentrated more and more in a smaller group, where this group has to become more authoritarian to sustain its position of power and often designs the state to benefit itself. And I'm particularly interested whether this can be avoided without just merely using, say, Confucian ethics, without adopting some of the ideas from Western countries to avoid this like balance of powers and democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, well, so it's not either or. I mean, I think that China is still willing to learn from best practices abroad, including in Western countries. But the question is that there is a worry of increasing concentration of political power at the highest levels, and what are the prospects for that? I mean, in the past, until recently, you had pretty good mechanisms for preventing abuses, such as term limits and age limits, and obviously those have been undermined of late. But I don't see why in the future they can't be re-implemented. And I think it's partly a generational thing. I mean, if you speak to people in China under the age of, like, I don't know, 60, there's like hardly anybody who wants to have a system where it's like, you know, one accountable person on top who decides everything and there's heavy censorship. I mean, I do think these social forces are very, very strong. And some of the current leaders have gone through the Cultural Revolution, where the worst of human nature was manifested, and it made them very paranoid and security conscious. And the next generation hasn't gone through that. So I think we have to wait another generation or so, and then I expect there would be substantial changes. but I may be wrong as usual.
Guys, we have a group that spans 3 continents. We have participants from North America. We have Europeans. I'm here in Budapest. There's some people from the Netherlands, some people from Sweden. There's some people in East Asia, and our speaker today, Daniel, is in Hong Kong, where it is now past midnight, and he has a lovely wife who is probably gonna kill him. However, if he doesn't come to bed at some point. So I think Daniel, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your insights. Next webinar will be on, the date is not yet determined, but it will be with the well-known Dutch sinologist Wang Pei on the party state. He is an expert on the subject of the party state, and I hope to see some of you there. I also will see some of you at the conference in New York in person, March 21st and March 22nd. And I'm looking forward to meeting, for example, Mark Stahlman in person there. And it's going to be good. Daniel, thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you for the lovely comments, and thank you. Bye.